Leaving Cert History students, let's have a little look at the Moon Landing 1969, which is one of the case studies for the United States and the world. With the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles after World War II, it soon became clear that the potential was there to send men and satellites into space. The United States thought that they had the edge in missile development thanks to von Braun, so they were shocked by the early successes of the USSR. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, which became the first satellite in space. Later in the same year, they also launched a dog into space. However, Laika died only a few hours after takeoff. In 1960, Luna 2 became the first man-made object to land on the moon. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space. In response to the early successes of the USSR, in 1958, Eisenhower set up NASA. In the same year, Explorer 1 became the first US satellite in space. In 1961, JFK promised to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. 3 separate programs were set up in the 1960s to achieve this. The Mercury program was to see if a person could survive in space. The Gemini program were a series of experiments relating to the moon mission. And then the Apollo program was the program developed to actually land a man on the moon. In 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space. In 1962, John Glenn orbited the Earth 3 times in Friendship 7. As I mentioned previously, the Apollo program was developed to achieve Kennedy's promise of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the 1960s were through. In 1967, Apollo 1 was destroyed by fire while it was on the ground, and the 3 astronauts on board were killed. Missions 2 to 6 were unmanned and used to test the rocket Saturn. Apollo 7 was the first US mission to carry a crew into space. In 1968, Apollo 8 made a successful manned orbit of the moon. And in 1969, Apollo 11 became the first manned mission to the moon. Apollo 11 was made up of 3 components. The command module, which was called Columbia, brought the astronauts to the moon and back. The service module held rockets and fuel. The lunar module, or the Eagle, landed on the moon. There were 3 astronauts on board Apollo 11: Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. At 9:32 a.m. on the 16th of July 1969, Apollo 11 was cleared for takeoff at the Kennedy Space Center. It was loaded with 2,000 tons of fuel, which burned at a rate of 15 tons per second. After 3 minutes, the launch escape tower was jettisoned. After 9 minutes, the second stage rocket was jettisoned. And after 11 minutes, Apollo 11 and the 3 astronauts reached the Earth's orbit. During the journey to the moon, the astronauts took part in live TV broadcasts and they ate freeze-dried food. The crew travelled 384,400 kilometres from Earth to the moon. On the 20th of July, Armstrong and Aldrin took the Eagle, the lunar module, and landed it in the Sea of Tranquility. Upon landing, Armstrong said, "Contact light on, engine off, the Eagle has landed." Stepping on the moon, Armstrong uttered that very famous phrase, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Basically, the audience heard "that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," but Armstrong has said he did actually say "that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." He was watched by an estimated 530 million people. The astronauts wore portable life support systems, spacesuits with an extra layer for added protection, and helmets with 2 visors. While on the moon, Aldrin and Armstrong planted an American flag. They collected rock samples and carried out experiments. Aldrin and Armstrong left a plaque on the moon that read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon." In total, the astronauts spent 21 hours and 36 minutes on the moon's surface before departing on the Eagle and docking with Columbia. The Eagle was then left to float in the moon's orbit. Columbia, protected by a heat shield, returned to Earth with parachutes to slow the entry speed. The astronauts splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, where they were picked up by the USS Hornet. They were then placed in quarantine for 21 days. The United States now led the space race. The Soviets focused more on the development of space stations. However, due to budget cuts, the last US mission to the moon was in 1967. Following the successful moon landing, tours, parades, and interviews were arranged for the astronauts. They were awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Nixon. A presidential tour was organized. They visited 24 countries and 45 days, and they even met the Pope. The moon landing was seen as a victory for capitalism, democracy, and the US in the Cold War. It was shown live on TV and broadcast on radio around the world. However, not all countries gave it such prominent coverage. China, North Korea, and North Vietnam all ignored the story, and in Russia, reports about the landings were slotted into regular broadcasts. Newspaper coverage also differed. In the West, it was front-page news, and many special editions and supplements were printed. However, Chinese papers did not cover the story on the front page. Pravda, the official communist paper in the USSR, placed it at the bottom of the front page. And the French communist paper praised the landings, but managed to keep the words United States off the front cover. Following the successful American moon landing, Russia did launch a spacecraft called Luna 15, but it crashed on the moon. They failed to catch up with the US and instead focused on developing space stations. The US followed up with 6 more Apollo missions. In 1969, Apollo 12 collected samples from the moon. In 1970, Apollo 13 failed to reach the moon due to a burst oxygen tank. In 1971, Apollo 14 set up scientific experiments in space, and Alan Shepard played golf on the moon. In 1971, Apollo 15 spent 3 days on the moon and had a moon buggy. In 1972, Apollo 16 was almost aborted due to engine failure. And also in 1972, Apollo 17 spent 3 days on the moon. Public interest in space exploration and the moon declined following the successful 1969 landing on the moon. The US had won the space race, and a lot of people just weren't that interested in it any further. The 1970s also saw a relaxing of tensions or détente in the Cold War. Economic decline in the United States also led to budget cuts for NASA. There was a shift in focus from the moon to space stations and missions to other planets. NASA then began working on reusable craft to deliver and retrieve satellites. It was designed to launch like a rocket and return like an aircraft. The first such shuttle was the Enterprise, and that was used in 1977. In 1973, NASA launched an experimental space station called Skylab. It orbited the Earth until it crashed down in Western Australia in 1969. Shuttles were incredibly expensive and difficult to operate. For example, in 1968, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded soon after takeoff, killing all 7 astronauts on board. And in 2003, the Columbia broke up upon re-entry, killing all 7 on board.